let's talk about liturgy. You've mentioned that a few different times in here. That's been a controversial point of late, and a sense that some have that they need to leave their church to go to a different denomination, or maybe even to become Catholic or Orthodox to be able to experience this liturgy and connection to history. How do you see this project, the Sing Hymnal, speaking into that controversy of late?
I think your point is a great one, Colin. And I mean, for what it's worth, we're seeing deconstruction at two broad levels of the confessional church right now. One of them is the person who life goes wrong and they kind of dump it as a bad job. But given that that's always happened in history, and also given the spurious way of kind of easy faithism that has happened and continues to happen in our generation, you go on a camp in the summer, or you go off to a youth event because you're chasing a girl or something, and you hear this amazing music and you have this feeling in your stomach and you think you're a Christian. Of course, you and I both know that's not. I mean, getting that flushed out, I'm not. I mean, I've got young teenage daughters. I don't dismiss the fear of deconstruction, but it's not. If you look at all the proportions and look at the stats of it, it's highly predictable. For the most part, what concerns me a lot more is the number of thoughtful leaders and businessmen who are involved at the heads of churches, who are moving to Catholic churches, non-confessional liturgical churches, Orthodox churches right now, simply because they are so sick of the nonsense at the front of our churches and the utterly empty and manipulated feeling that people are leaving church services with.
Yeah.
And suddenly when they go into an Orthodox church, number one, it takes away individualism. Number two, there is a gospel shape to it that is just right. Of course, we don't necessarily agree with all the liturgical parts of all of those services, but there is still a largely gospel shape that, because God has created us and we're fearfully and wonderfully made, it just makes sense. And so it gives us a peace. There's a poetic beauty to it. And then there's a sense that this is our worship leader, but we've had 5 worship leaders in the last 13 years, and 2 of them had to be fired for immorality or whatever. And we're going to a church that, they've been doing this since like 1648. Do you know what I mean? And suddenly everything seems a lot more sensible. And so, as I said, I think that speaks to the wraparound issue that it is. Do you know what I mean? That there's an older generation, but there's also a younger generation who no longer accept all the presumptions that a previous generation had for church and are going back to first principles of logic. And for them, the liturgical service, which was why Luther was so determined to create a gospel-shaped liturgy, and Cranmer was so determined to create a gospel-shaped liturgy, because if we can get back to that, suddenly we have a framework for everything. And it is true to say a lot of these churches don't preach the gospel, and that's sad. But I would also say, as a second note, those churches have survived, and the liturgy and the hymns are the only thing preaching the gospel in those churches. Churches that didn't have that don't even survive. Do you know what I mean? No. So I think that we got to be careful how we use our logic there, because we can argue exactly the wrong thing, or argue it actually upside down.
Right. Or prove too big of a point as well. Prove too much in the argument. Church members might be surprised to learn that musicians and preaching pastors do not always get along. Can this hymnal help bridge that?
That's going to be the quote. That's going to be the quote of this whole podcast. That is incredible.
I'm just trying to keep this calm.
Colin, when did this start?
This is shocking news to you, Keith. I know.
It must be the current political establishment. It was, blame them.
I mean, it is. I guess has it always been that way, or did some of the different changes that we've made in our expectations of music set us up for that conflict?
So I think the answer to that question, as you and I would both know, the answer to that question is yes and no. Musicians by their makeup are never the easiest people to get on with, and then even just some of the priorities and principles of historic evangelicalism candidly have not helped themselves in their relationship to those who are creative. And so there's there's endemic issues that would make interesting podcasts or PhD studies out of that. I think the problem more recently is two or threefold. One is there is a terrible theology of what worship and singing now is in the church that is far closer linked, far closer linked to sales and marketing and to therapy than it is to holy worship. And so we need to get a clear theology of what we're doing. Secondly, there is mass confusion. There is mass confusion compared to 50 years ago on what kind of songs we sing. If you were Presbyterian living in Alabama, you kind of knew how you sang. You all sang the same way, and whereas now it's everything. So there's a cultural change that hasn't quite landed yet. Any cultural change, whether it's a new pastor or a new house or a new dog in your house, require cultural changes and shifts.
Yeah.
And those haven't quite landed, I don't think. But I think there are some basic ones as well, in that because the modern worship leader is given such a pathetically high platform, they forget that you know they they're there to serve a church and they have a boss. Do you know what I mean? So, for example, when we do Carnegie Hall or Oliver Hall or whatever these shows, or we're playing Grand Ole Opry, doing two shows at Grand Ole Opry next week, you know, we have lawyers who do our contracts and make sure that we can control our show and our message, and that they can't superimpose a message on us. When I'm leading in church, if the pastor says to me 5 minutes beforehand, "I'm changing the song," or "We're having to cut time because there's a backup in the car park,"
Oh,
I say, "What do you cut?" And he cuts my. He is my boss. I honor my pastor, um, and I honor they're my leadership. And there's a very clear structure that should be no less clear than military structure, in my opinion. So any church out there, any pastor out there who's scared to tell his worship leader something, or who the worship leader is able to do stuff and the pastor doesn't know how to tell him, I think I can already predict that I'm pretty much 90% sure you're heading for absolute chaos somewhere in the next 6 months to 6 years. And so I think that's maybe you disagree, Colin. I don't know.
no. I When I was training for ministry, you start to see that we often run into the same problem for the same reasons. It would be the preacher who's really great at preaching, and people think, well, you don't need to care about his character because,
Yeah.
and the qualifications of eldership, because look at how great a preacher is. It extends to youth ministry.
Yeah.
We don't really evaluate and expect a lot out of his character because he's great with kids and he
Yeah.
loves
He's
hanging out with
funny. He's
them and
charismatic
he's
personality.
charismatic. And then in music, we don't seem to really value the character parts or the qualification parts, and we'll just throw somebody up there because their voice sounds great and they're good with the music, and not really understanding that people can be attracted to those things for really bad reasons,
Yeah.
which is why the character requirements are so significant there. And then we wake up and we wonder why we have problems.
Yeah.
I don't think that should be that much of a mystery
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
us.
No, 100% agree.